Good afternoon, everybody. That's if you're in Europe, and good morning, everybody, if you're in the Americas. This is the ARM panel on the state of the investment in cell and gene therapy. My name is Matthew Durdy, and I'm your chair for today. I'm the Chief Executive of the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult. We've got a panel together to cover the various ranges of this subject, and it's a great panel, and I'll just give you their names, and they'll introduce themselves in more detail a little bit later. We have Alice Renard from Syncona Investment Management, where she's a partner. We have Nicholas Moore, who will be joining us very shortly, who's the Managing Director at Stifel. We have Rachel Mears, who's a partner at Jeito, and we have Brian Silva, who is CFO and Head of Corporate Development for Freeline Therapeutics. And without further ado, I'm going to dive into the first question. We're going to start at the emerging end of investment with companies coming out of research and spinning out. And I'm going to turn to Alice and say, we're going to be talking across the range today, but what's the state of investment in companies emerging from research? And what sort of things are you seeing? And is it a competitive environment for you? And how do you do it differently? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization as well, please.
Okay, great. Thank you, Matthew. Thanks for the question. And it's really good to be here on this panel today. So just a little bit on myself and Syncona. So my name is Alice Renard. I trained as a pharmacist initially, worked a bit in investment banking at Barclays and joined Syncona 3 years ago as a partner. So I work on the investment team, and I'm also splitting my time as head of operations for one of the newest gene therapy company called Spring Therapeutics. So just a little bit of background on Syncona. We are a life science investment company. We were funded in 2012 by the Wellcome Trust, so the UK charity. And that was really because the Wellcome Trust was giving away a lot of money for biomedical research every year, but weren't really seeing that money being translated into products for patients. So they set us up with this goal in mind. And today we are a publicly listed company, so somewhat independent from the Wellcome Trust, but our vision still remains the same. So we take a really long-term view to funding and creating companies, as well as financing them with the vision to develop products all the way to market. So that's really a little bit about Syncona, and so this vision really ties in nicely with your question, because what we are doing really very often in terms of our investments is to actually spin out companies from universities, create some companies ourselves, rather than coming in and invest into companies that are already created. And this is something that we have been able to continue doing for the past year. So we haven't really seen a major impact from the pandemic or the recent events on that end of the market. So we are still able to really create relationships with academics at universities, for instance, or in major research institutions, and then be able to talk about the science, talk about the preclinical experiments that they're conducting, and then sometimes go all the way to spinning out and creating a company from the research that they're doing. One of the examples for that is really Spring, so the company that I mentioned earlier. This is our sixth AAV gene therapy company in Syncona's portfolio. So something that we have experience doing, we've been doing for a long time, and we continue doing. So Spring is a company focused on developing gene therapies for the kidney. So treating chronic kidney diseases that don't have a lot of treatment options at the moment. So this is a spin out from University of Bristol. We formally launched the company back in November last year. So very much into spin out mode, into construction mode at the moment, where we are recruiting the team and really making the company, taking the company off the ground really running all the operations, etc. And yeah, we've been fortunate enough to not see a lot of disruption from the pandemic or COVID. For instance, we have been able to find labs in London where the company is based. We have been able to find office space. We've been able to order equipment, although it's been delayed. Some of the pieces of equipment have been delayed, for instance, because of the pandemic and Brexit as well. So there's a little bit of a mixing of effects there. And we've been able to recruit top people into the company too, which is really a crucial point for us. Something that is new though is operating a virtual company and having to do everything remotely, which I think is additionally challenging when you're trying to launch a new company. So we're just trying to come up with creative ways for the team to get to know each other, for staff to learn how to work together and interact together. But yeah, I would say that the market on this end has been quite buoyant. Yeah,
that's really interesting. The idea that you've got this extra burden in terms of that quite difficult process of spinning out, and that you can't bring the team together to form that nucleus. Does that affect the way that you value the company, or is it just that's just the new way of doing it, so everybody else has got the same competitive pressures on them, so you still have to pay the same amount for what you're picking up?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that the value is affected in itself, because most of the time it's really a delay rather than anything, rather than the ability to get the people or get the materials, for instance. It is, yeah, I mean, we'd like to go as fast as we can, and we'd like to, for instance, be able to conduct all our experiments in our lab, and that requires both the people and the material. But sometimes we've been held up for a lot of technical reasons, whereas it's on the recruitment front or the procurement front. But I think this is what a lot of early stage companies and startups face continuously, and I don't really think it has impacted the value for us. It's just created a bit of a delay, but not too long a delay, I would say.
Okay. Another thing that's interesting about the approach that you're taking there is that actually it seems like your principal focus at this point is on the science. Is that true? Or are you actually taking a much bigger picture view of what the opportunity is? This is one of my personal bugbears, a focus on the science, which I think is justified in the early stages, but we'll talk about it more in the later stages. How are you analyzing these companies? Is it just around the beautiful science, or is it about the business?
Yes, we are really focused on the science. So that's something that is a major component in our diligence before creating a company, and still has a very prominent role as we operate the companies and as we go along. So we really have kind of a product-focused strategy when it comes to what we look for in a company. We are looking for technology that is developed by global KOLs, so leading academics in their fields, with IP that has the potential to have dramatic efficacy for patients. And we're also looking for products in areas of high unmet clinical needs. We're not interested in incremental innovation or investing in me too or follow-up compounds. We want to really target that part of the market with products that have the potential to really move the needle for patients. And so we're looking for really defined lead commercial programs, but also a potential for a pipeline, because for us, those are really the main key ingredients of creating a new company. And in terms of what type of products per se do we look for? So we look for products, as I said, in areas of high unmet need, but also for products that target specific patient segments, for instance, or anything that could bring us to an accelerated clinical development and also accelerated or more favorable regulatory pathways, really to enable the strategy of our companies, which is to bring products all the way to market. So shorter and more streamlined developments will mean that, just for once, the capital requirements to develop those products is lower. So that's really what we're looking for, and a really strong emphasis on the science.
Great, thank you. Rachel, Brian, you're both have been close to this space and the evolution of either your careers or your companies. Do you have any other perspectives for the audience about this spin-out space and what really matters, what doesn't, and how competitive it is at the moment?
I'll be happy to comment on that. So thank you again for including me, Matthew. This is a great panel. I'm happy to be here. But to add on a little bit, Jeito, as a relatively new fund based in Paris, is biopharma focused, a little bit complementary to Syncona. I would say we typically enter companies post-company formation, somewhere between Series A, but could go all the way to crossover, and then we typically hold positions. So we've seen a lot in the last 2 years in the space that you're talking about in terms of spin-offs and spin-outs. I think the market for innovation in terms of company formation is very strong. I think one of the things that we've seen, though, is critical that was mentioned is when we go to look at a company that's been formed, the way Alice was describing, we're really looking for two things. The first is the science, but backed by the quality of the team, because we need to know that that science endures in terms of being a market leader. And so that ends up helping us sort through what we think is right now a very high quality market for innovation, for investments. But the other piece that I would emphasize, especially for Jeito, is that we critically look for platforms or pipelines that can be accelerated, because when you're coming in these days at a Series A or even a crossover where we can get into valuation discussions, I think in the market dynamics a little bit, you're really looking for a team that's now poised to operate aggressively against value inflection. And I think that's where we start to see some real differentiation in how we look at our deal flow and how we sort through what innovation really has the legs to go further than formation. And so even though we're seeing very high quality science at our stage, we tend to look very closely at how that science will then enter serious development and then potentially scale into the clinic.
And when you say there's a high quality market for innovation, are you saying it's great because actually we haven't got much competition and we can go and pick off the brilliant innovations? Or are you saying actually there's huge amounts of competition out there and the investors are now really sophisticated?
I would actually differentiate a little bit on geography. Jeito is a fund that is very flexible in where we invest, but we do have a critical focus on Europe. So about 2/3 of the companies that we invest in are Europe. And what I would say there is the quality of the science, the quality of the academics, the thought leadership, the papers, the research itself is extremely high quality. I think the opportunity for investors, which we've seen, is to really deploy capital against that. And in that sense, it's not competitive. There's enough land for everybody, I think. The bigger question is how you syndicate aggressively to get to growth stage, where I think it is more competitive for those dollars, especially for European companies. And I won't profess to know all the ins and outs of the public markets, that's to come. But when you get to growth stage investing or post-company formation investing, I think what we are finding is that, at least for our fund, we tend to see a lot of valuation conversations and aggressive valuations for Series A and then crossover companies. But I think in Europe, there's still enough room against the high quality innovation such that not everything turns into a bidding conversation about the highest price for the company. And quite frankly, I think that makes for an easier path to acceleration. And quite frankly as well, continuity investing, which is what Jeito is mostly focused on. And that is planning for success, but also staying with a company when they hit a bump. And certainly more modest valuations and better alignment with who you're bringing into these rounds as investors ends up being key factors for us when we look at especially crossover, but even Series A investing.
So Brian, I'm going to come back to you later to talk about continuity investing, but did you have anything you wanted to say about the early stage experience in the past or your observation?
Sure. Sure, thank you. And thanks for having me on the panel. Very, very interesting and timely subject. So I'm Brian Silver. As you mentioned, I'm the CFO and head of corporate development for Freeline Therapeutics, which is actually has relationships with two groups on this panel. We are an investee in a company that was founded by Syncona, and also we are a customer and an operator in the Catapult and Stevenage. So we have good connectivity to this group, and we're happy to be represented here. A couple of observations. We are a spin out of University College London. Professor Amit Nathwani invented the technology that Freeline is prosecuting in liver-directed AAV gene therapy. And I actually also happen to sit on the board of Professor Nathwani's next company, which is a spin out of University College London as well, in a different area. And so I've seen this kind of firsthand. That company is much earlier stage than Freeline. And what I've seen is that I think to Rachel's point, there's a lot of innovation in Europe. I think Europe and the UK have very generous scientific funding, maybe more continuity of that even than compared to the US. But what you do have is an opportunity that Syncona and other investors have seen, which is you can find technology and innovators here in Europe at valuations that are frankly more attractive than if that same technology were at Harvard or Stanford or wherever in the US. And so there's a structural opportunity. And then the challenge comes, and something we've worked through at Freeline is getting founded and getting the spin-off funding in Europe there's plenty of value there, plenty of money to be put towards those companies. I think where you have to cross that valley is how do you get those Series Bs and Series Cs done as a European company that may not be that well known to the US market. That's something we have worked through, and we're able to do a Series C and an IPO in 2020 where we raised $300 million during the pandemic. And I'd say actually in some ways the pandemic was helpful to that because it leveled the playing field of European versus US companies. If we're all sitting here on Zoom, looking at screens, it doesn't really matter where you are geographically, while there has been, in the previous world, a little bit of a barrier for US investors to get on the plane and come see companies in many different European cities. So in some ways, the pandemic has had a leveling effect. And actually, I think, it's strange to say this, but beneficial for investment in European life sciences versus where it was before.
So I'm actually going to switch the order of the questions a little bit. I'm going to come back to Brian and talk about this crossover, and then I'm going to come back to Rachel and get her perspective on an analysis as well. So Brian, go back to my bugbear, which is everybody's just obsessed about the science and they don't look at the business, right? What's your experience of that fundraising activity, and maybe you're in a fundraising fairly soon. What are the investors telling you about what they're looking at within a business right now when it's at your stage of development? Are they still obsessed about the science, or are they moved on to the bigger business picture?
No, they're very much looking at the business. And the reason for that is now it has become table stakes that you have products that are safe and effective. And that one of the beauties of cell and gene therapy compared to a lot of other modalities is that, first of all, you can tell a lot from preclinical experiments, and especially from the first human experiments. You can learn a lot from, a phase 1 trial. And sometimes products have been approved off of what is not much more than a phase 1-2 trial. So safety and efficacy, at least short-term safety and efficacy, you can learn a lot about that. But on the other hand, that means a lot of other people can do it too. So you've seen a lot of areas become very crowded very quickly. And so then it's about speed to market, but even more so about differentiation and quality. So if you have, products that are more or less safe, and then you start to look at efficacy and you look at durability, which is important in this area, certainly on the gene therapy, gene transfer side. And so then those become business questions, because these markets, especially for rare diseases, are only so big. And so it's the person who gets there. It used to be conventional wisdom that the first person to get there with a sort of minimally effective therapy will take most of the market. I think that's still true in certain areas, but I don't think it's true in cell and gene therapy, especially one-time therapies. What we've seen from our market research and discussions with KOLs and patients is that because it's a one-time treatment, at least under current technology, they want something that's really going to work. So having a treatment that is somewhat effective and somewhat durable, that's better than not having it, obviously. But because new generations of therapy are coming so quickly, people really are looking for what is going to be the best possible therapy that it can get in this sort of window of innovation. And that's what they're going to wait for. And those really become business questions. So it is, just having something that works is no longer going to win the day, which it might have, a number of years ago.
And Rachel and Alice, Alice, let's start with you or Rachel. Is that your belief when you move on to the next stage of funding? Are we getting better at analyzing the business as opposed to the science?
Yeah, I was going to say I completely agree with Brian. And I would also emphasize the fact, and it's probably something that we look at with a lot of scrutiny, especially when the companies grow and they look to raise more money, is really the platform, especially in cell and gene therapy companies. And I'm talking about platform in really broad terms, and anything that can generate IP around the products. For instance, for the gene therapy constructs, that would be, having a proprietary capsid, proprietary promoters, these kind of things, developing your own range of analytics for CMC. So that's all the manufacturing, product developments, things like that. But also having, for instance, a proprietary delivery method. And that's something that we have put a lot of work and strategy into when, with some of the other gene therapies that we've developed. So for instance, gyroscope and, their device to really deliver the gene therapy to the back of the eye. So that's something that we think is going to make a real difference for those advanced therapies. So it's the product in itself, all the IP that you can generate around the product, but also all the additional things such as delivery, such as analytics, that are really important. And I think as investors start to realize the potential for gene therapy companies, they start to understand that these things definitely matter. They wouldn't have put a lot of emphasis in process development a few years back and assumed that any CRO could do it. But that's something that we think creates a lot of value to have within the company nowadays.
Great, thank you. Rachel.
I would add maybe 2 comments to this discussion, which I think is very, very helpful. The first is probably a little less specific to gene or cell therapy, but I think is critical when you're looking at a post-Series A investment particularly, is that right now with the markets the way they are, so many people focus on the inflection to get to IPO without necessarily focusing on what's going to happen post-IPO. And I think when we look to how this translates to scrutiny on the business, we take a look not so much at the IPO timeline, and that's relevant, and it's highly dependent on the market, but we look very closely at the 24 to 36 month actual business operation to say, what does the footprint of the company look like? And it goes directly back to what Brian said. When we do this, and Jeito's taken it so seriously that we've changed our operating model, or we started with a differentiated operating model where instead of having just operating partners, we actually integrate into every investment team a full value chain analysis, which includes manufacturing, IP, clinical development, and quite frankly, we scrutinize the commercial target product profile from day one. So the entire end-to-end business gets looked at, partly because I think it's important that when you're at the stage of a Series A, or in these days, Series B/crossover, you're looking for what's going to happen in that growth phase robustly and not just in a market dependent way. And that gets pretty deep into a business. The other thing that I would say specific to gene and cell therapy is that we look at the mid-stage platform evolution, not just the first wave indication. And I think this, providing a little more color on what Brian was saying with this, we've had a lot of conversations with what are the second and third potential applications of your platform. How are you thinking about IP on that from day one? How could you defend your market leading position if you do end up with that first indication showing that you've got something that works? And that pairs very closely then with some of what we used to consider the more mundane conversations around manufacturing and process development, because at the end of the day, you need that sophistication. I think what has evolved in this space, though, is that you now have a lot of external partners that are evolving that can help you. So it used to be that you had to control everything from day one. And I think we are seeing some evolution on that in a good way, I think, for these companies to actually scale to their ambition for growth. So those would be the two comments I'd add to this discussion.
That's great, thank you. Can I just pick up on that point? Because I think that's an important update for people. If you were in this conversation in many different panels in many different places over say 2 years ago and 3 years ago, the whole conversation would have been about where's your manufacturing? If you haven't got manufacturing, you're not going to talk to you. Are you saying that the market has matured now? because there are more available options and it's less of a risk. Clearly, it's an important part of the business, but it's no longer so obsessively compulsive in terms of being the deciding factor.
Well, Matthew,
actually,
oh, go ahead, sorry.
So I would just add quickly, Matthew, I would not say that it's been de-risked at all. I think we still look at it very closely for risk. I would say that to some extent, though, the initial conversations about having your manufacturing set for first indication are table stakes. And similar to what Brian said earlier, the conversations now pressing onward to evolution, to broader scale, other applications, and quite frankly, in some cases, lower cost of goods platforms, sometimes 5 or 6, maybe even 10 years out, and how you're thinking about staying competitive in some of these spaces where you have follow-on indications that go to much wider non-rare disease application.
Brian?
Yeah, I was gonna agree with that. I think that it is a couple of things. I would say in the COVID era, we have seen shortages of manufacturing capacity. We've seen shortages of pipettes, of stoppers, of everything, glass, everything that you need to do manufacturing. Even sort of scale-up work at a lab scale has been tighter. But what has happened, I think, structurally is as much as capacity has been built for, let's say, what I'm familiar with, which is gene therapy manufacturing, as much as capacity has been built and new investments have been made, those have been filled up because the number of trials and the number of indications is increasing very rapidly as well. So I would say, at least what we hear from investors is that it's still very, very relevant, your manufacturing strategy. As everyone on the panel has said, what is your strategy? And then controlling your destiny still has a lot of value. So you see a lot of companies our size, and we're certainly among them, thinking at least about, do we build our own plant? Do we do it ourselves? Do we do it in conjunction with other organizations, such as Catapult or professional CDMOs, commercial stage entities? There's a lot of discussion that has to happen there in different business models and different funding models. But one thing is clear is that if you just rely purely on CDMO relationships, if your company is going to develop any sort of scale, that's a business risk that people take a look at. And so you do have to think about something broader where you put sort of capital at risk from the company side into ensuring the future of supply. The other thing I would say is that in our case, for example, we have 4 disclosed programs, 3 of which will be in the clinic by the end of this year. And those programs all work, every single one of the 4 of those work on the same capsid and the same manufacturing system, which is very important. That makes the company more investable. So if you have a common manufacturing process and you work out the kinks, which does take time, and there's steps and from an academic scale to manufacturing to sort of mid-stage clinical scale to commercial scale, there are steps and leaps that have to happen in each of those, and those all have risk to them, as participants in the industry will have seen. But once you've gone through that journey once, if you can apply that learning and those assets to your next set of programs, it reduces the cost of capital of the company, increases the cost or decreases the cost of goods, and it makes the company sort of more and more investable as each program proves out the ones behind it.
Very interesting. I'm going to change tack slightly here, going back to Rachel. And so you talked about the approach that your organization takes and similar organizations. Now, if I was perhaps in Brian's position or another company in similar sort of positions, I'd be looking for a substantial raise. I want to get a decent amount of money and really push forwards into the development of my company, not just the products. That immediately takes people's minds towards the public markets. They start to think, we have to go and raise substantial amounts of money in the public markets. Is there an alternative within the private markets that's can match the kind of scale from the public markets? And are there advantages to it that you should be thinking about?
I'll start with that one, and maybe I'd open it up to everybody else as well. Look, I think we have to acknowledge what's happening in the public markets first, which is that for many companies, whether you're in Europe or the US, if you're on the right path, you're executing well, you have a great team, your Series B is a crossover right now, or is being looked at very closely, and certainly your Series C is if you're at that point. And I think there's a reason for that in terms of going to the IPO route, especially in the United States, and I'll just focus on the US public markets because that's where I think you get the substantial raise that you're talking about. I don't think that there's necessarily a private equivalent for the long run, especially for some of these technologies, and partly for the reasons Brian just elucidated. I mean, there's a very high need for capital once you get to a certain point. That being said, I think we are seeing a compression of raise such that there are much higher raises happening earlier, whether you're in Europe or the US. US is certainly setting the lead in that. But I think when it comes to crossover, there's still the opportunity to treat that as a traditional Series B. And I think there are a lot of investors who are not looking at that round right now as necessarily a guarantee of IPO. I mean, certainly you're planning for success, but I think there are a lot of syndicates that are coming together to make sure that there's also a plan such that if the markets soften and you're not accessing capital straight through into an IPO, that you actually have a logical company and raise. And that puts a lot of conversation pressure on exactly what your crossover valuation is going to be and the timing for your inflection. But I do think that for some of these technologies, when you go into clinic, you're going to be hard pressed for a purely private raise at some point. And I think we'll have to see how that evolves. But what I would bring it back to is, Jeito has a continuity model. And so we've recognized that continuity financing is pretty critical, especially in Europe. I think we highlighted earlier on the panel the fact that growth capital hasn't been as accessible sometimes. And so I do think that robust Series Bs and Series Cs are going to still be available because investors see that there's still a need for that, even if the public markets soften a bit in the coming years.
Okay, interesting. Alice, you've got a portfolio of early stage investments in Syncona. You want to see them go somewhere. So you're obviously, as an organization, paying attention to what the following funding looks like. Is that your experience? Are you seeing plentiful supply from public and private markets, or where are the squeezes?
Yeah, I think for us, it's really important to recognize that we want to develop globally competitive biotech companies. And it is just a necessity to syndicate and access a pool of capital coming from the US, for instance, because that is really where you have a deep pool of experts, specialists, long-term investors in that space, especially in the cell and gene therapy space for us. So it is really kind of a natural place for biotech companies that are at pre-approval stage to go to access that investor base, and really that gives them the profile that enables them to continue their development towards the marketed product. So we have listed quite a few companies. Autolus is listed, Freeline, Achilles as well recently. So for us, it's all about widening the access to capital and also accessing those specialist investors that you can't really access elsewhere. So, this sort of specialist subsector pool of investors, such as the one that are evaluating gene therapy companies or cell therapy companies, does not really exist on other market exchanges. So that's something that is important for us to acknowledge, and that goes to the strategy of building really globally competitive biotech companies.
Can I just drill down on that and be clear about what I think I heard, which is basically, if I oversimplify it, if you want to have that expert investor alongside you, you're probably thinking private as opposed to public. And then if you want to go for scale, eventually you're going to end up in public. Is that fair assessment?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that it's always better to have someone that really understands what the business is about, what the requirements are from very early on. And that's something that we've been able to provide at Syncona. Our model is really to kind of do it alone at the very early stages, and then start to syndicate where we need to start accessing those public pool of capitals, as I said earlier. I think it's really important to have those kind of investors very early on that are able to provide a track record of having invested in cell and gene therapies company, for instance, if that's what the business is about, because they will be able to help you along that journey. For instance, we are very hands-on with our investments. We are able to position those companies from success early on. We want to help them accelerate their journey towards value inflection points. And that's really something that you cannot do unless you have a very technical type of investor, as we are for the private type of investors early on.
So Brian, that sounds like you've got a massive choice in front of you. You can go public, private. Views on this? What's your taste? Where do you want to go?
Well, I would say it's a great point, and I think for companies to survive over an economic cycle and over a market cycle, you need to have a diversity of funding sources. So speaking from the company side, you want to have sort of a bouquet of investors in the company as quickly as you can. So you want to, when we constructed our Series C, we were very thoughtful about the types of investors. So we have in our Series C some mutual funds, we have some hedge funds, we have some biotech sort of specialist long-only investors, and you really need all of those to come together to carry the company, because one of the smartest investors I ever knew in my banking career, which I did before I was the CFO of Freeline, said to me once, "I want to fund the company to make it all the way across the lake." And I've never forgotten that image. You don't want to be stuck in a rowboat halfway across the lake. You need to make it all the way across the lake, which is ideally more than one value creating milestone for a company, so you can have further funding. That's typically found in the public market and with a diversity of sources. But I will say for certain companies, you have seen them stay private for longer. So AskBio in North Carolina was a very successful example of a company that had TBG and other investors in it that were able to carry it for a while as a private company. And they had a manufacturing aspect of that company as well that was more of a traditional, let's say, private equity type of investment. So there are other investors out there who can write pretty big checks, and they do have specialist biotech and healthcare teams within those investors. It's a minority of the cases, but there are some important exceptions. So I'd say the short answer, at least from my point of view, is public markets are generally where you're going to end up, but there are private market players that are definitely worth spending time with if you have something that will appeal to what they want to do.
If I could, Matthew, because I just think it's such an important point, what Brian just said, I do think that when we talk about geography as well, you haven't necessarily seen the AskBio example coming out of European companies traditionally, but I think you will start to see some of that. It's been hard because the market the last 18 months has been very, very friendly to IPO. So I think it's been a trend that's something that can emerge if the market softens particularly, but I do think that there are investors out there, especially given the development timelines and the kinds of technologies that are now accessible through the gene and cell therapy space, that a little more time can actually do exactly what Brian's saying, which is get a company farther across the lake. And private investors like that. There can be outside returns to getting your platform proved out beyond first indication of it. And I think AskBio is a great example of that. So, I would just echo that, partly because it's pretty core to our model. We're always happy to do a high value IPO when it's best for the company, but part of the continuity investing model is to syndicate with partners who are looking to really build market leaders. And that's usually more than one indication, right? And one more application of the technology. So I think AskBio is a great example.
So I'd like to take you all into an area slightly perhaps be controversial about it, because it's the best way of teasing now. And that's about the state of the public markets, actually, at the moment. You mentioned that it's a fairly friendly environment. Two conversations I've had recently with the CEOs of companies. One of an investment company, he basically said, seems a bit frothy out there at the moment. And the other one was a company he basically said, look, I'm $1 billion company, and we've been going for 10 years. We're all over the science, okay? And all anybody ever asks me about is the science. When are they going to start asking me about my business model? So my question is, what's the state of the public markets? Is it over enthusiasm? Are we getting frothy, or do you think there's plenty to run? Should we be wary? Should we be making alternative plans? Who wants to kick off with that one?
I'll step into the breach here. So as I said, I was a banker for many years before this. And one thing I learned very quickly was commenting on the state of the public markets or the valuation of individual stocks is a very risky thing to do. And you will be humbled by the next day's events. So I'll be careful, except to observe what has already happened, which is we're just coming up on roughly the 12-month anniversary of the market lows when the pandemic really took hold at this time last year. And since then, you've seen, there's been a stunning recovery really in the markets because of stimulus and easy money policies. And that has flowed into a lot of different sectors. And you saw up until very recently, momentum and technology type of stocks do very, very well out of that, which is not a surprise. And biotech has sort of been carried along for the ride there. And so biotech stocks and the biotech indices have done very, very well. They reached their peaks, let's say, in February of this year, and then they've come down, somewhat substantially to, they've come down, 10, 15, 20%, depending on the index and the time you're looking at. And so they have crested, certainly for the short term, but they still remain very far above their lows. And I think the drivers of that, or the pandemic itself, actually has highlighted the value that pharmaceutical technology can bring to the world when it needs it most. The vaccines and the companies that have developed the vaccines, those have obviously benefited as they should, but there's a halo effect around all of advanced biotechnology. And then you have investors, who are looking at the maturation of cell and gene therapy. This has gone from being, sort of science fiction to, things that are done in esoteric ways at universities to now almost mainstream medicine in certain areas. Certainly cell therapy for oncology has progressed to that level, and gene therapy is rapidly heading there, and gene editing is getting there as well. So I think that the maturation of the technology, the fact that it, in certain cases, it really, really does work and provide permanent cures, it's hard to ignore that for a generalist investor. So I'd say that, I guess the short answer I would give is that the market is, whether it's frothy and whether it's frothy at this moment, I'd leave to others to judge. All I would say is that things in the world have changed such that there is some basis for this, because, at the end of the day, the market, what do they say? In the short term, it's a voting machine, and in the long term, it's a weighing machine. And so technologies that actually work and provide benefit to patients, that will come out in the wash in terms of companies that are sustainable. You could argue that certain early stage companies that went public last year off of, scientific promise but no actual clinical data, the market will sort that out soon enough. But there will be, as in every wave of innovation, there will be companies that don't make it, and there'll be a lot of companies that do make it based on, whether or not it actually works.
Yeah, I think I would like to really echo that, because, I think the public markets have continued to be very supportive for biotech companies. We've seen generalist investors come into the space alongside more traditional specialist investors. I don't really know, it's too early to say whether they're here to stay or not, but really to echo Brian's point as well, I think we're really focused on products. And so supporting the companies to develop products, based on great science and delivering really good data. So we think that if companies can continue to do that, it's good for patients, and investors will do very well as well.
Perhaps I can just say one thing, again, staying away from predictions, which, I've learned, but not by being a banker. The first thing I would suggest here to complement is simply that, we've seen now, I would say we're well past the first wave of these technologies proving out their benefit. And so I think it is the right time to see the maturity of general investors digging deeper into the nuances of what it means to be lasting business in this space. And so to some extent, whether there's froth or not, I think it's good that dream is actually turning to reality, because reality is a much more robust business opportunity for investment across this space. So I look at it as extremely positive. That being said, the sorting aspects for investors who are familiar with the space, for everybody who's in the audience, become pretty clear. I mean, there are going to be things that are hallmarks of companies that are well put together to withstand public company life and for enduring investment. And I think it's been fairly clear when we look at those opportunities, we're asking pretty straightforward questions that anybody who's sophisticated in the space should be able to think through in their business plans. You can't get rid of some inherent technology risk, but I think when you think about whether you're at this stage, Syncona invests, or maybe Series A or crossover, I think there is the right kind of scrutiny to last post-IPO. And I think most sophisticated teams are well prepared to put that together. The only other thing that I would add is I actually think in gene and cell therapy space, with the pandemic specifically, where we have seen the potential for acceleration on regulatory and the scrutiny on supply chains and other aspects, that I think that will be a lasting impact, not so much from the IPO cycle that we've seen these last 18 months, but more from the pandemic cycle, is really how do we take away the lessons of probably the fastest moving effort in the history of the world in biotech and see what can actually stay as accelerators. I think is going to be something very interesting, and companies in this space are well poised to think through that, particularly on the regulatory side, I think.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've only got a few minutes left. I'm going to do a very, very short summary, and then I'm going to come back to each of you, and I'm going to ask you for more predictions, as you know. So, what have we heard? We've heard that the access to capital for companies emerging from the research sector is still vibrant, and there's plenty of help and assistance there. And we've heard that there are at least two different routes, and possibly a combination of those that you can go on for further expansion in terms of planning for public markets and for private markets. We've heard that there's a reasonable sophistication in the analysis. We're also hearing that there's a maturity with respect to the public markets and what is going on in terms of their evaluation. And we are talking about two fundamental changes, one which is potentially in long-term valuation, certainly in short-term valuation, and potential accelerators coming out of the COVID crisis that may mean a fundamental acceleration of the industry. So it's possibly the most positive environment that I've heard described in a finance discussion like this for a number of years, and they just keep getting more positive. So in that point, I'm going to come back to each of you and ask you just very quickly in 30 seconds, when we're in Barcelona next year, all right, what are we going to be looking back on over the last year? And we'll go in the order of first speaking. So Alice.
Well, I think so. First of all, looking forward to somewhat a resolution of COVID, vaccination rollout, and starting to resume business as usual. We really want to start resuming considering investments in Europe, for instance, but we need travel for that. We can't just be doing everything over Zoom. It's especially when you're investing in new people, investing in new technologies. And just touching briefly on technology, I think really looking forward to taking gene therapy outside of the rare disease or orphan space, and outside of monogenic disorders as well, and trying to really broaden that. That will bring its own set of challenges, whether technical, CMC, etc. But I think that's something really exciting for the future.
Great, thank you. Rachel.
So I think probably a year from now, we'll be looking at some sorting having been done. I am going to be positive, but I also think we've all been very careful to say that good investments are good investments and fundamentals are fundamentals. And in this space, those tie pretty seriously to actual development beyond the dream of the science. And I think we'll see some sorting, because I don't think any of us have ever seen a perfectly executed development plan without any bumps. And with so many public companies now in the space, those bumps will be very visible and very clear. And so I do think that we'll see a bit of sorting by next year. But I'm very, very hopeful that the disruption that's come from creating teams, which I think Alice has highlighted, that came through with COVID, will hopefully subside, so that, the war for talent is something that's much easier to do just simply because of logistics. And I actually think that that's a key predictor in both gene and cell therapy for the success of a company, is getting the right development team in place. And that's been tough this last year with people unable to travel and move. So those would be my two thoughts.
Thank you. And very quickly, Brian.
Sure. Look, I'm always hesitant to make predictions, as I said, because the market has a way of humbling them. But what I think I can safely predict is that there's a huge amount of cell and gene therapy products and clinical trials. And I think, as has been said very well by Alice, I think that, and by Rachel, I think you're going to see separation of what works well from what doesn't work so well. And you're going to see a lot of progress in the clinic. And I think it is safe to predict that you will see a year from now a number of landmark clinical trials in these areas read out. And you're going to see some very, very effective medicines that are going to make a real difference to people, which is ultimately the point of what we're trying to do here.
Brilliant, thank you. We've come to the end. I'd just like to say, Alice, Rachel, Brian, thank you very much for your expertise and participation. And we look forward to seeing you next year.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.